Welcome to Conversations. I'm Scott Turner, and our guest today is Dr. Stephen F. Hayward, who is Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University. Stephen Hayward is a prominent conservative commentator on issues of politics, environment, and energy. He's a prolific author. He has written several books, including the two-volume The Age of Reagan, as well as the Almanac of Environmental Trends. He was most recently the inaugural visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And he's a frequent contributor to powerlineblog.com, one of the most widely read right-wing and conservative blogs on the internet right now. Stephen is with us today as a guest for an event at ESF, Conversations in the Discipline, that is built around the question, how do you depolarize the environment? And Stephen, welcome to ESF.
Well, thank you, Scott.
And we're glad you could be here. So let's just jump right in. Why is it that environmental issues, from fracking to climate change to vaccines to all those kinds of things, why is it that these things are so predictably politically polarizing?
Yeah, it really has become predictable, and it's among the most polarizing issues in any that you can poll on in politics today. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons, and you can apportion the blame across the board. Conservatives have been hostile to environmentalism, especially in its more apocalyptic and left-wing expressions. Then I think people in the middle, there's a lot of moderate environmentalists out there who tend not to get heard, actually. I think a lot of them in academia. They get drowned out by people on the far left who embrace the issue early on. And that's really the irony is, you know, modern environmental policy began really in the early 70s. And the thought was, people who are old enough may remember back in those days, at the end of the 60s, we thought social policy had really hit the rocks. The Great Society hadn't worked out very well. And the environment was thought to be the new consensus issue for the 70s that everybody could agree on. And that's what we'd make progress on. And we did for a while. You know, the initial Clean Air Act passed almost unanimously, or maybe did pass unanimously in Congress. Richard Nixon and Edmund Muskie, they had a bidding war to see who could be toughest on reducing air pollution. The Clean Water Act passed almost unanimously. The Endangered Species Act, which has been ferociously controversial, had Republican co-sponsors. One of them, believe it or not, was Strom Thurmond. Today, this is unthinkable that you'd have something like that, right? What happened is somewhere along the way, a lot of pieces to this, I think the apocalypticism of certain kinds of environmental thought, you know, that the world's coming to an end, this sort of hypercharged Malthusian version. That was attractive to a lot of people on the left who actually openly said the environment is a new way of centralizing political control. You know, James Ridgway said that almost in those words in the New Republic. At the same time, you have conservatives who don't like bureaucracy and regulation, mostly for sensible reasons. But I think that led a lot of my fellow conservatives to make a category error of saying because we don't like regulation or because it's expensive and hurts the economy, therefore, environmental problems must be phony or exaggerated, and that's a non sequitur. And I think conservatives, many of them, have defaulted from doing the serious thinking about, all right, what do you do about a problem? If you don't like the EPA, fine, I don't like a lot of what the EPA does or how they do it. What's the alternative? What's the other way of addressing water pollution, species loss, biodiversity loss, and so forth? And so I do think that my own side, to be self-critical, has been derelict on this subject.
But you know, there's a broader historical sweep in all this, and you wrote about it in the first volume of The Age of Reagan, namely that, you know, we've had a more than century-long project in conversion of governments and the progressive project for American government, and you spoke about there being three waves. The first one being Wilsonian progressivism, the next one being the New Deal, I believe, and then we're now in the third wave. And one of the attributes of this third wave is an increasing importance of the regulatory state and away from the normal kinds of checks and balances that existed and that were being challenged by Woodrow Wilson. And something in that has changed in the past 30 years. What do you think it is?
Well, it might be possible to speak of a fourth wave under President Obama, but that's a large subject, although there's some environmental parts to all that. I think you need to go back to the beginning. There's several parts to this, but one important one was, I think, a mistake made 100 years ago, and I think it's fairly easy to state it. People like Woodrow Wilson and then later Franklin Roosevelt, to take the most well-known advocates of this. Roosevelt famously said, "The age of enlightened administration has arrived." And Woodrow Wilson thought our problems now are not political in the classical sense of really arguing about fundamental differences. Our problems now are technical. So what we need to deal with our technical problems of the 20th century is a technical elite. Bureaucrats in the non-pejorative meaning of administrators, let me use that term. And there's something to that point of view, of course. You do want some kind of technical expert process, for example, for the Food and Drug Administration to approve a new drug. You wouldn't want Congress voting on whether to approve a new drug from a drug company. But the mistake was in supposing that James Madison was wrong in saying that humans are self-interested, if men were angels, if you know the famous passage from Federalist 51. And one of the things I think that modern scholarship shows is that bureaucratic organizations, they behave just as self-interested as a for-profit company. Bureaucrats can be just as selfish or narrowly motivated as any private individual or selfish individual can be. Add to that how regulatory agencies can be captured or they become zealously single-minded about their mission. And that's just the beginning. So I think it was a mistake to suppose that our problems were only technical. It turns, Mayor LaGuardia once said there's no Republican way or Democratic way to pave a road. And that's certainly true in the ordinary sense, but not quite. You tend to see liberals favoring more direct regulation. It's not exactly socialism, but it partakes of the command and control mentality. Conservatives tend to favor markets in a more of a spontaneous order. And those are fundamentally different approaches to how we should think about and solve problems.
One of the things that's going on in the academy, though, and this may again be reflective of larger trends in the political culture, is that we train a number of our students, or the ambitions of a number of our students, is to go work for regulatory agencies, to go work for the EPA, to go work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and this, I think, speaks to something broader in our culture. That is, there seems to be a pull away from the normal kinds of checks and balances that have always existed in our constitutional system, and to put more and more power into this regulatory state. The need for regulations has always been there, but it's just in the past 30 years or so that it has really become difficult. And so what's happened since the 1970s when Strom Thurmond and Richard Nixon sat up there and signed a bill together?
Right. We now regulate, I think, much farther beyond what anyone imagined. And I think that connects, by the way, to one aspect of polarization in a lot of issues, not just the environment, is the more things government tries to do, the more, first of all, it taxes the limit of its own competence. We saw that with the Obamacare website, for example, and what a disaster that was on the unrolling of it. But things like, we're actually going to have a standard for light bulbs. The cliche is we made the incandescent bulb illegal. It's not strictly true, and that actually was a piece of legislation voted on by Congress. But still, a lot of people say, well, now we're talking about my light bulbs and, a shower head that I use. And, all these things have sort of a plausible rationale behind them. But a lot of citizens just say, isn't this too much? That's a lot of what's going on, I think. I will say, though, that, one part of me wants to encourage you to send students out to work for regulatory agencies. I know that has been a very disillusioning experience for a lot of people, because they'll get to the EPA, they'll get to the Department of Interior, and they'll say, this is what goes on? They sort of can't believe how inefficient it is, how removed it is sometimes from the substance, how corrupted it is by politics. The other thing, not everybody, but a lot of people have that experience, and they don't necessarily become conservatives, but they do become cynical and disillusioned from the political process, and that's problematic.
Okay. Our guest today is Stephen Hayward. We'll come back to this interesting topic after the break. Welcome back to Conversations. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen F. Hayward, who is Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University, and our guest for a Conversations in the Disciplines on Depolarizing the Environment. So before the break, we were talking about the issue of light bulbs, and this is kind of an avatar, exemplar of this conflict between regulation and just trusting people to do the right things. And my daughter, I had two teenage daughters for a number of times, and this was many years ago. And I got so frustrated with their seemingly genetic inability to turn the lights off in the house that I went to compact fluorescent light bulbs without being prompted by anyone. And the amazing thing was that it cut our electricity bill in half, and it was an amazing thing. And so here's an incentive that it probably would have taken care of itself. And yet, one of the assumptions of the regulatory state is that people cannot be trusted to do the right thing on their own. Do you think that contributes to the increasing level of polarization that we have on these issues?
You know, there is a remarkable paternalism in a lot of regulation today. You don't just see it on energy, but you do see it, well, I mean, the one that drove a lot of people crazy was Mayor Bloomberg wanting to ban 20-ounce sodas in New York. Okay. The light bulb thing is a little more interesting because it was actually a performance standard. It didn't actually say incandescent bulbs were illegal, but it said it had to use a lot less power. That made compact fluorescents better. By the way, I have also used them for years for the same reason, but I did like the choice. There were some places I'd like an old-fashioned incandescent bulb, slightly different light and so forth. And what does annoy me is the removal of any choice in the matter, right? And the other thing, but we have a long history of trying to do performance standards for refrigerators, for air conditioning units, and so forth, and those have gotten a lot of results. On the other hand, one of the things I've noticed about new houses in America is they often nowadays have 2 refrigerators. This in the technical, semi-technical jargon of the energy world is the rebound effect. We tend to conserve some energy, but then with our gains, we either drive further and our cars get better mileage, or we get 2 refrigerators or 2 flat screen TVs. And at the end of the day, if we actually had clean energy sources, quote unquote, that's a long story, but if we actually moved to non-carbon energy, why would we care about what light bulb people's use? So our energy policy has been a muddle at best for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, but there's something about our political culture which had built into it safeguards against overreaching by government to take care of that sort of thing. But now that all seems to have gone away, and we have the EPA telling us that no, you may not choose that light bulb. You must, cut down on the amount of CO2 you emit, all those kinds of things. What's changed in our political culture that makes that happen? That has empowered government to start reaching into our lives in such intrusive a way?
I think the general answer is once you set a mission for government writ large or an agency of government, there'll be no stopping point for it. Whether it's environment, whether it's civil rights has been problematic for how do we do equality, and we carry that out to the nth degree. I think this is a problem of liberalism, is it has no stopping point. Generally. And I think that explains part of it. Remember that there's 2 problems for a bureaucrat. One is if you accomplish your mission, because then you're out of a job. That's one of the problems. And the other one is, that's related to that, is if you accomplish your mission, your budget gets cut, right? So all the institutional incentives for regulation are against some kind of political control or some kind of limit. And now, when you separate out, it's one thing if your commission is appointed by a president or appointed sometimes jointly with Congress or states by governor and legislature. There's some measure of political accountability, but now we set up these independent administrative agencies. The president can't remove you from office if he or she wants to, and they really do operate autonomously from both Congress and the executive branch. And the EPA is kind of like that. It has one administrator. It doesn't even have an old commission model like the FCC or something. And I think we're in the middle of rethinking this. Chief Justice Roberts has raised eyebrows by saying, I think we really are seeing some legal and constitutional problems with the administrative state, a phrase that I like and have used for a long time. And now the court can't do them by themselves. They have to be brought a case. But I think that's coming.
Well, that's very good news.
We'll see.
I'm really glad we will see, yes. So let's get into some of the origins of your thought and how you came to think the way that you did. You've been involved in environmental politics for a long time, starting back from ages ago in California, and it's rather well. You've said it already. There's a tendency for Republicans to be on one side and Democrats or liberals or conservatives to be on the other, and yet you have a kind of a nuanced picture of what the role of the state is and should be in cleaning up or regulating or taking care of the environment.
Yeah, well, I'll make a general point that relates to something we said earlier. You tend to make policy progress in this country when two parties compete for an issue. So education policy is something two parties compete about with voters. Healthcare to some extent, and other things of that kind. And there hasn't been any competition on environment. It's sort of been a monopoly of the Democratic Party. That's actually bad for the environmental cause if you're an environmentalist. I don't think they quite perceive that. My own case is I grew up in LA with really bad smog, and I can remember vividly as a kid, I couldn't play outside in the summertime. If I did, in 15 minutes I'd have to lie down, my lungs would hurt so bad. And then in graduate school, I took up the Clean Air Act as a class project, and the short version is it ruined my life. I never got out of it because I went to graduate school to study traditional American politics and American government and fell into the environment, not entirely by accident, but it sort of stuck with me ever since. I'll just close that by saying that one of the reasons I worked on long books about Ronald Reagan and write about a lot of other subjects is if I did environmental work 40 hours a week, I'd probably die from self-inflicted wounds before old age.
So you said something in there that's kind of intriguing, which is, the presumption is that polarization is a bad thing, that somehow we have to get over this polarization and come together on something. But you just said we actually make progress when we do have a polarized political discussion.
Well, it's perfectly fine to have really sharp arguments about things, and we always have had. But I do think that what's missing is that the two parties need to. I'll put it this way: we got a No Child Left Behind Act 10, 12 years ago, and by the way, just about everybody hates some part of it, and maybe has some part they like. It was a classic political compromise. It's unthinkable that we could have a genuine No Species Left Behind Act. And the Endangered Species Act isn't that, right? It's very defective in a lot of ways. But replacing that with a No Species Left Behind Act, nobody's even trying. And part of it is that Republicans aren't interested, and Democrats, I think, want to keep a monopoly on it. And there's other factors involved. But that ought to change if you're really going to do anything. The last major piece of legislation we've had on the environment was the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. That's 25 years ago now. That was passed on an entirely bipartisan basis. Took a long time. Lots of the usual arguments between regional interests and industry interests, and the two parties want this, but it finally passed at the end of the day. Environmentalists got a lot of what they wanted, but not everything. And President Bush was deeply involved in it, and that's sort of my last grump, is President Bush went to Rio, committed us to the climate change framework, pushed the Clean Air Act. How many environmental groups endorsed him for re-election? In round numbers, 0.
Well, we'll come back to this after the break. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Hayward, and we'll return to this subject when we come back. Welcome back to Conversations. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen F. Hayward of Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. So, the polarization of environmental issues, it's a multidimensional issue. It's political, it's cultural, it's scientific. And now I'm speaking as a scientist, and the assumption on our side is that science is objective, and it should inform public policy, not only inform public policy, but actually direct public policy because it's right. In the academy, you have a lot of different intellectual monocultures going. The famous liberal monoculture in universities. I don't think that's such an issue here, but you can also get a scientific monoculture that's divorced from these kinds of broader issues that have to be attended to. So where do you see science fitting into, say, an issue like climate change or fracking? How should it properly influence the debate?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of sort of seemingly small mistakes that have had large consequences. One of them is the way people casually say, science says, as though science was the Oracle of Delphi, right? And it's one thing for science to say there are the following risks of fracking that we've discovered through the following investigations. Or there's the following, we know that this has happened to the climate and we have these reasons for thinking this is what might happen in 50 or 100 years. You can't predict the future with that kind of surety. That's one of the difficulties here. science doesn't tell you exactly what or how to do it, right? In other words, if there's this risk of fracking, science doesn't tell you what the remedy is. Is the remedy certain scheme of regulations directed to well casings as one of the problems of fracking? Or in the climate case, science or scientists, that doesn't tell you whether you should have cap and trade, a carbon tax, what kind of alternative energy should be developed first, how to do the research and innovation of that kind. That's much more a policy question, which of course gets wrapped up in politics. And so the point is that, this again is the similar error of, as I was saying earlier, Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago, thinking that science suggests that purely the technical problems and therefore a technical remedy should be obvious when it's not, right? I mean, an awful lot of policy questions revolve around the economics, right? We can't all build our own personal nuclear reactors. That would be carbon free, but obviously that's not going to work for not only economic reasons, but materials reasons, right? Not enough material in the world to do it. So they've been casual about saying, gee, we should just follow the science. Well, we should listen to it, absolutely. But it doesn't actually tell us where to go. And most scientists, I think, when you talk to them about it, understand that and acknowledge that. And it's sort of been in the media and activist class where that phrase is most abused, I think.
You mentioned the activist class, and of course this ties into another issue of how science should influence policy, and scientists are always under pressure to go out and do service, to give back, and there's a legitimate argument for that. We are dependent upon the taxpayer. We have to give them benefit. Our benefit is in part education, but there is a constant pressure to go out and do more, to kind of bridge the, to jump over the wall that divides science from activism. Do you think it's possible for a scientist to be a good activist?
I'm an optimistic and hopeful person, so I'd like to say the answer is yes. The problem is sometimes scientists, I think, exceed their mandate. In other words, I mean, I've seen a lot of cases of scientists, academic scientists, who do really good research, but then they go one step further and say, therefore, the answer should be X, and they really cross the line from just giving scientific expertise to becoming advocates for a particular, sometimes ideological position, and I think that's a mistake. I think to step back to the broader point to begin your question, it is, I think, unfortunate that academic scientists feel that kind of pressure. I do wish there were more space to just pursue knowledge for its own sake. And I have to say that it's not the fault of academics this has happened. I mean, one of the things that I point to, it's now 20 years ago, but Bill Clinton pulled the plug on the superconducting super collider for budget reasons. Maybe he was right to do so. But that means now that the advanced particle research has to be done in Switzerland at the Large Hadron Collider. It's a really neat thing. It's really expensive. It's not clear what practical benefits come out of that. That's just being done for the old-fashioned reason of pure theoretical knowledge, which I think is what universities should be about. And this is a large problem of universities today, and it's connected to a lot of other problems of higher education. But I think that's one everybody should worry about, no matter what their ideological stripe is.
Yeah, there's an interesting debate going on among scientists now. The extent to which we actually have freedom to pursue objective knowledge, and there are some who would argue that, well, this is just an illusion. That in fact what we study depends upon what government agencies funded by taxpayers are prepared to let us study, and again, this is something that's governed by policy. So how do you untangle all that sort of thing to be able to keep intellectual integrity? That is, to be a credible scientist without coming to appear to the general public, the taxpayers who are supporting all this, after all, as just another pressure group looking for money.
Boy, I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. It's not a brand new problem. I think it is getting worse. But I mean, when graduate school 30 years ago, I remember doing a couple of casual research project on National Science Foundation funding. And certain things were rewarded and certain other things wouldn't be, and it wasn't necessarily ideological political reasons, but you might say path dependence, and an awful lot of science, I think this is not a controversial statement, has always come from the renegade, the outsider, the iconoclast. Mm-hmm. And it's much more difficult for that kind of person to thrive in the university. By the way, in all disciplines, it's not just in the sciences, it's in the humanities and social sciences too. The pressures for conformism, I think, are unfortunate and growing.
Well, that's unfortunate, but we were talking earlier about how it is that you foster this kind of intellectual independence. And if you look at the biographies of great scientists, you find some remarkable things, namely that they have often been renegades. They've had great difficulty in fitting in with the conventional academic culture. And then this just comes back to, what are we in the academy doing? What is our role? To what extent have we sold our soul basically to funding sources? And I don't know the answer to that either, except we like the ideal of the independent scientist, but there are so many pressures that are pushing us in the other, and actually in many ways a destructive direction. And so, what can academics do, and what can politicians do to make this right?
Oh boy, that's a really tough question.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth academics, especially in the sciences, trying to think about ways to educate politicians about that problem. And I have seen, by the way, it's across the board, but even some conservative Republicans who get it. They say, and this happened in a budget hearing a couple years ago, yes, there are certain research tasks that no private company will ever do, and it will depend on government funding if we're going to have some breakthroughs in basic materials science. We do it on a very large scale, by the way, in health research through National Institutes of Health. We spend a huge amount of money there. That's an easier thing to get. There are problems with it, but it's an easier thing to get because it's about health, and you have all these diseases out there and people who have them who lobby Congress. It's harder in the area of energy and environmental studies and other scientific fields, because that link takes a couple of steps of abstraction for your average politician. But I think it's worth trying to talk to them. That kind of thing has to be organized. That's hard to do because everybody will have a different idea how it should be done. But somebody ought to try and herd the academic science cats and give it a go.
Well, I hope so, because the relationship between the state and the academy is a fraught one now, and it will require a lot of open conversation, honest conversation on all sides. Stephen Hayward, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to our event tomorrow. This is Scott Turner for Conversations, and we will see you next time.